come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is Siddhartha Vaidyanathan at Sidvi on Twitter. And today I'm joined by three guests, two of whom are part of the 81 All Out gang, and one of whom is a regular listener of 81 All Out, so we'll also say is part of the 81 All Out gang. Let me introduce the guests first. Welcoming from the West Coast in the US, Rohit Nampally, who is at Noompa on Twitter, big fan of the NBA and also a cricket fan, somebody who blogs on basketball quite regularly and is also a keen watcher of cricket. Hey Rohit, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me. Huge pleasure.
Great. Wonderful to have you on. And we have, for the first time, I must say, quite surprisingly, we have Deepak Murugesan, who is part of the 81 All Out gang, who is an integral part of the Other Banana podcast, which is our sister podcast. Also an NBA fan, also based in the West Coast of the US. So a lot of commonalities there. Hey, Deepak. Great to have you on 81 All Out, man. Took a while.
Yeah, good to finally come on, Sid. And I assure our audiences that Rohit and I are different people. So
yeah, so there may be more basketball talk here than cricket talk if we have our way. Except, of course, we also have Ashoka on the show. Ashoka, regular 81 All Out podcast guest, and also great troller of Kartikeya Date, as many of you would know, regular listeners. Ashoka, who is AB1 on Twitter, and has also said that he has taken a vow to only watch cricket and no other sport. So, yeah, so he will be the one who will be talking mostly about cricket here. Hey, man, Ashoka.
Hi. Deeply regret that my identity is now troller of Kartikeya Date, but yeah, fine. I would assume that identity.
I should make it chief troller because Kartikeya, of course, has like an army of people ready to troll him at any time. Yeah. So, we don't have Kartikeya on this pod. So, this is a KD free pod, KD free zone. Anyway, so the topic we have for today is something, again, which is quite general, not talking about any match or series or anything, but it's an interesting one. Rohit had actually suggested it on one of our email exchanges, and I thought it was interesting. The topic of fandom and loyalty and what we generally take for granted when we say someone is a fan of some team or some player or some franchise. Traditionally there has been a definition of fandom. This is way before the age of globalization and the age of satellite TV and internet and everything, which is like you generally support a team that is from your city or from your geographical area, and you regularly would follow the team. You would go to the games, physically go to the games. You would have a certain relationship that you would have built over time. But obviously that has all drastically changed with all the changes that have happened in the world in terms of television, internet, the general immigration and large amounts of immigration and globalization that we have today. People sitting in Bangalore identify very deeply with a team from small town Germany, a soccer team from small town Germany. And they may have never visited the city. They may not know the language. They may not know the culture of that place, but they stay up late in the night to watch that league and watch that game, and they feel deeply connected to it. And, that's just one example. You have various others. So we thought it'll be interesting to talk about this whole changing aspect of loyalty in cricket. Of course, now with franchise cricket here to stay, that's developing some interesting dynamics of who people are supporting, the player versus team dynamic, the generally, what is loyalty? And you also have loyalty can also be an extremely political term because not supporting your country then makes you a traitor in some people's eyes, which is at some level ridiculous, but which is also very dangerous when you think about it. So anyway, so these are all like the general overarching themes we'll talk about. We'll go into other sports and other aspects of it. As usual, reminder, we recently republished Cricket Beyond the Bazaar by Mike Howard. So pick it up. I'll put the links in Amazon and Flipkart And so pick it up wherever you can. It's a wonderful read. It was a classic work of cricket literature as far as I look at it. And this is the second book we published after War Minus the Shooting by Mike Marquesi, which is about the 1996 World Cup, the travelogue, but it's also much more than a travelogue. It's some of the best cricket writing that you'll read as well. So pick that up too, if you haven't. Anyway, so given that, Rohit, you were the one who sort of came up with this thought and started this email exchange with me, maybe you can sort of set the stage about your thoughts on this and what you think and why you think this is something that is not discussed and interrogated as much as it should be.
Thanks, Sid. Just before I start, one thing, I mean, everyone probably knows this already, but it's a huge thanks to you guys for the service you all are doing basically by republishing these books. I mean, they're both phenomenal books, and hopefully there'll be more to come from your publishing house. But I also think War Minus the Shooting bears a lot on this conversation and this topic, because I mean, Marcuse is able to get right to the heart of ways in which sometimes fandom is manufactured, and the way you have this whole superstructure of entities that think about how we can cultivate these various aspects of fandom, and it had a big bearing on me. Another book, just as a caveat, and I mentioned this to you when I was in my email, that's kind of influenced how I think about this, is a book from 1983 by Benedict Anderson called Imagine Communities. Now, Benedict Anderson was approaching the idea of nationalism, but I think there's a lot we can take away from how sports fandom is constructed. One of the things, two things he points out, amongst others. One is that this idea of the nation and this feeling of nationalism is not as old as we think. We think of like the nation as this age-old concept, sui generis. Like, of course, you take it as granted, and he sort of gives the lie to that. And I think a lot of that is true with some of the things we take as axiomatic about fandom. I'll try to get to that. And then the other is he talks about how this idea of nationalism is fostered, and what he identifies in the 80s is the rise of print media and the fact that people who live in very disparate parts, who can't communicate with each other, you can construct this shared entity through a shared vernacular, and like the rise of what he calls, I think, print capitalism. And I think it isn't a coincidence that the global spread of franchise sports, but also just the fact that I think the way you put it was, you have people in small towns in India who are rabid Manchester United fans, say, that it's coincided with, I think, globalization, the rise of social media, and the internet penetrating so many parts of the world. And so just to the first thing about, there are lots of things we take as axiomatic. I think, I live in the Bay Area, and the Golden State Warriors have been a dynasty for about the last, say, 9 years or so, give or take. And so there is this feeling that there are a lot of fans who are bandwagoners. And maybe this is something we'll get to later. And I think one thing that we take as almost axiomatic about fandom is that that's somehow inherently wrong. You grow up, you either support a team from the get-go or you don't. And I think bandwagoning, there's this sort of pejorative connotation that's distinct from having grown up with it. Is like, oh, you're only here for the good times. And at some level, it's like sports is something we follow for fun. What's wrong with being invested in winning? Like, people like winning, So that's one. But then the other idea that you would support a team instead of a specific player, I think that's another just fascinating thing to interrogate a little bit. And then, especially, I think you mentioned that both Deepak and I are NBA fans. And I think over time, we've seen this shift where you see a lot more people who are, say, Kevin Durant fans right now, or Kyrie Irving fans, which is its whole set of issues, versus being fans of teams. And I think the third thing I'd love if we can touch on is how this sort of intersects with the rise of things like the IPL in India, which is just a very different model for how we thought about Indian sports. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. And hopefully that's like some of the background.
Yeah, talking about bandwagoners, one point I wanted that came to me was during the 2005 Ashes, which was so historic for England and such a sort of a game-changing moment for England. There were people writing articles saying that, if you were not the kind of person who lived through the dark times of England losing, then you won't understand what it means to win. But that it's such a ridiculous thing to do, because in the economic sense, you actually want more people to follow the game in England. In England, there they are really desperate for more fans, and because football is the number one sport there, and cricket wants more fans. So you actually want more bandwagoners from the cricketing economic perspective. But then you have people, pining for saying that, I lived through the moments when England were whitewashed, but now I'm finally able to, express my fandom. And it's like, come on, man. I mean, you need more people to come in and give the money. Anyway, Deepak, Ashoka, any early thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, I think the idea of bandwagonism is sort of rampant, right? Like post 2004, it's quite easy to be a Red Sox fan, but the Red Sox of pre 2004, they all the diehards will say like, "Oh, we lived through Babe Ruth's curse," and
100 years or something, right? When they didn't win. Yeah.
Yeah, basically since like 1912 or 18 or some like ridiculous year when they traded.
Years. Yeah.
Yeah. So when they traded Babe Ruth to the Yankees, and so like the idea that there is any team has a set of core fans and then a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys after they start winning, I think is a rampant perception, I think, across all sports. It's not just necessarily cricket or NBA or even the Golden State Warriors. Like a lot of people will give me grief for like cheering for the Warriors because they believe that I have no context for basketball. But the fact of the matter is I lived in the Bay Area in 2006 and I watched the We Believe Warriors, who in some senses played with the same level of abandon that the current Warriors do. And the main difference was that they never won anything because they didn't have someone as transcendent as Curry or as good a shooter as Clay is. So the idea is like I think people rush to adjudicate judgment, and I think that comes a large part from where fandom itself comes from, right? Fandom comes from a certain place of judgment. Like ultimately, it comes from it comes from a place of belonging, a certain sublimation of identity. It comes from that place, and so. There's a certain fervor associated with it that I know I don't want to use the word religious, but that's kind of what it is. It's a sort of religious fervor associated with fandom, which you sort of see manifesting in multiple different ways in the collective conscious. I think what's happened, I think like the biggest change for me since say 1910 or whenever Babe Ruth was traded to now is our ability to consume sports as they happen concurrently has just increased multiple fold, right? You can, like the very fact that someone in a small town in India is able to stay up. The fact that the supply of the soccer match is there to meet that demand is very interesting. And to me, the big question is, someone somewhere built the supply, assuming that the demand will come, and the complete. Just the complete brashness of that kind of capitalism was like, if you build it, they will come. Is like it's something that sitting in the 90s, I would never have had the gall to assume that you would be able to watch a Galatasaray match at any given time in India. Like concurrently as it's happening in Turkey, you can watch it in India. Like that's unheard of. And so I think the biggest piece for me is the role that media itself has played in the change of fandom, right? So in terms of, and then as the media landscape itself has evolved, the fact that it touches and impacts fandom so heavily, it has changed how fandom has evolved as well. And I think like that's the biggest piece for me, and I hope we cover that in the conversation today.
Yeah, you spoke about the 90s, right? I think that's pretty much when even a lot of Americans American professional sports teams started seeing it. With Jordan, when he went to China, there was like the whole city would come to a standstill because Jordan was there. And, that's when they started seeing how global a sport they can actually make the NBA and basketball. And so I think, those individual players like Jordan and then Kobe after that, and Kobe also huge in so many parts of the world. I think they actually made the NBA a lot more global than it probably could have been, it would have been in the 80s. But bringing Ashoka in. Ashoka, you did mention an interesting fact about how all of us in this podcast, and also all of us who generally do the 81 All Out podcast, met each other primarily through cricket, right? And cricket fandom, and how the whole podcast and everything else that we did after that is only thanks to the fact that we love cricket. Otherwise, we would have probably not even been in the same sphere as each other.
Yeah, so a couple of points, right? Like Deepak was saying about religious fervor, and by and large, that is true. And secondly, the effect of technology that has had in sports commentary. And sports commentary, I mean a larger commentary other than specifically calling the game. Like it has given ability for people who are sitting and watching the sport at home. It has given a voice to them to express themselves, right? And that has actually changed the contours of how we see fandom in sport. I'll speak specifically to cricket because as all of us have lived through the 80s and 90s of sport watching, primarily let's say cricket watching, we are all monotheist to large extent. We are all Sachin fans, then who then graduated to seeing other cricketers saying, okay, these guys are also great because of the skills that they possess, and and how they play the game and approach the game. So that is kind of a larger window into fandom for me, because I started as a Sachin fan. I was every stereotype that you can throw at me that would apply, like turning off the TV after he's out, like watching it only for him. Then I mean, at some point that experience felt incomplete because, but you can say that I also played the game to a very very less extent, and I knew the match didn't start and stop when a player got out or when the player is playing. There is a larger aspect to this, and there are various skills at play, and only via noticing those. And the technology of the 90s was the TV, right? And what television showed us, that's what we picked up. And once you had the ability down the line with matches streaming, you can watch things at convenience. You can watch, highly curated clips and things in slow motion, ultra slow motion. You get a different perspective of the game. You get a window into the skills that different people, applying the trade. That broadens your appreciation, and then you question. There is actually a a self-existential questioning of what am I doing, why am I only doing this, and why am I only supporting a player when the opponent is as good or as bad. So that I think is like a natural progression for a fan, uh, and it has aided. I mean, it has been accelerated a lot due to technology. Today, as I was talking to you, I think before we started recording this pod, I was telling you I'm watching the Dulip Trophy final also in parallel, which I am doing right now. It is unheard of. I mean, it is impossible to think that you can do a thing and parallelly watch sports, which has actually added a lot of dimension into fandom, and it has given you a lot of data points for you to consider and educate yourself about the game, which is the most exciting part for me.
Yeah, no, I think the one specific thing that I find very intriguing about cricket itself is there's the technology piece, and then there's the hyper commercialization piece that you get added on top of it. Like for example, I see no reason why the Syed Mushtaq Ali Trophy couldn't just be the IPL. It makes no sense for me that this superstructure exists on top of an already. I mean, it wasn't that popular, I guess, but the infrastructure existed for a tourney, and yet they created this hyper commercialized, borrowing heavily from American sports, franchise superstructure on top of an existing structure. And for the life of me, I can't understand why they would do that. And it'll be interesting to cover, why that thing was created and what the impacts it has on.
No, because one of the reasons why Lalit Modi was very keen on that, because there was, I mean, the BCCI is all set up to have whatever they want. All they would have needed is to say, okay, this many foreign players, these teams can all start buying foreign players. You have an auction, and you can basically do the same thing that you're doing with the IPL. But why he was totally against that was because he wanted private investment. in specific teams. And when you have a BCCI owned like structure, and when then you have a parallel private investment that is backed by the BCCI, he felt would make a huge difference. And I think, to be fair, he's been proven right. I mean,
He's been proven right.
Yeah. So, if compared to, say, the Tamil Nadu 2020 team, the fact that you have this entity called CSK, which draws from all over the world and all over India, which is also, I mean, the BCCI is essentially feeding the IPL teams. It's not that the IPL has created any new, any major infrastructure to, say, Barcelona found Messi when he was, 10 years old or something, and then nurtured him through and he played for them. It's not like IPL is doing anything like that. But the fact is that they have this parallel entity going on backed by the BCCI, which has now become its own monster in its own right. And people like Ashoka are now diehard CSK fans and all. But of course, Ashoka is probably a diehard Tamil Nadu fan as well. So he's an exception in that case. But I want to also talk a bit about the historical aspect of it. And, I feel fandom has not so much like it. There was obviously people in the 60s and 70s. It's not like they weren't fans of things, but for them, because of the accessibility, things were very limited. So you would read a lot of things in the newspapers. They would be like, obviously they followed the Olympics and the soccer, the football World Cup, and they followed a lot of that was covered in their newspapers. But for instance, I don't think too many Indians living in the 60s and 70s would have necessarily known much about American sport. Any of the American sport, primarily because they weren't probably covered in the newspapers that they were reading or in the magazines that they were reading. But British sport, on the other hand, and the global sport like the Olympics and soccer, I mean, they're huge. I mean, in places like Kerala and Bengal, they've been like, huge fans of Brazil and Argentina way before TV even existed in India. And, so that has happened. So I think it's the value of access comes into play there, right? It's like what you can only be a fan of something that you read about or something that you know.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, as much as, I'll talk about, manufacturing fandom and, this idea that capital is creating it. There is a way in which viscerally being able to feel and watch something is just different. I mean, I remember when I used to read Nirmal Shekhar's reports about Wimbledon, and it was something different to say, oh, I'm a fan of Pete Sampras's game because I read about how he served and volleyed his way to Wimbledon, versus being able to actually see Federer play on grass. So being able to, just see what that looks like and feels like. And I think that is a dimension to sport that, as cynical as I can be sometimes about the way in which fandom is cultivated and curated and, guarded in some ways, it just, you feel it. And I think that's why you might have a lot more people coming in now. And that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have never seen, I'm a huge Ayrton Senna fan, and I've never seen Senna drive live. I've only seen historical, I've seen Asif Kapadia's clips in the documentary that he made. And that, I've only seen everything retrospectively. And the only way I knew who Senna was reading the newspaper reports, right? And so good writing has a large, or at least it did in the past, have a large part to play in developing fandom. And I think even before that, just verbal reports that you hear from people around you whom you have originally placed your trust in. So parents, older siblings, cousins, etc., who tell you that, who sort of confer status upon people as I had never seen Gundappa Vishwanath bat, right? But I knew at 6 years of age that he was a very elegant batsman, and that is a standard to aspire to for most batsmen. And there is no way that I had that idea that young without it being a conferred status from people whom I trusted in my inner circle. And so I think fundamentally the historical, I think most of us feel a need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, either from an aesthetic sense or from from just a personal identity sense. And I think so. I don't think fandom is entirely, as Rohit mentioned, it cannot be entirely manufactured by capitalism, but it can be virally grown.
It can also be. And it can also be totally whimsical, right? I mean, I know I have a friend actually who basically his dad spent about 6 months in Wisconsin, way back in the 80s or something, and he just happened to buy like a Green Bay Packers jersey and take it to home. And home was England that time, and they weren't watching the NFL or something at that time. But the fact that his dad had a Green Bay Packers jersey made this guy sort of feel close to the Green Bay Packers. And so the moment he started watching NFL, he said the only team I didn't care about was the Green Bay Packers, because there was his jersey at home. It was those colors. And his dad wasn't even a fan. So it's like just this small, tiny connection to that team, which then made him, and now he's like a huge Packers fan. Like he follows all of Packers games. But the fact is that it just took that tiny thread to then open that window out for him. So it could be anything that just leads you into it, right?
Right. And actually, if you don't mind me just going back to something Deepak said, I think it's very interesting what Sai about wanting to feel connected to something bigger, wanting to feel connected to other things. And I actually think there are these twin sort of impulses that are in tension that I think get to some of the issues we started with like the sort of antipathy people feel towards, say, bandwagoners or something, right? Because simultaneously, there's a desire to feel connected to something bigger. I mean, I remember when, waking up before the India-Pakistan match in the 2011 World Cup and wake up at 2 a.m. on the East Coast to watch it and thinking like, gee, there are other people doing this at the same time. And that just feels cool. This is like our thing. And I feel connected to these people. But simultaneously, there's this desire to almost like you have your own special thing. And like, those are kind of in conflict, because on one hand, you want to be connected to this broader community, but at the same time, you want it to be special. Which is why I think you end up with basically half of India claiming to have been in Chennai in '99, in the stadium watching the match. So, I mean, I think that's what I think where you get these kind of tension points where people are trying to mediate between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I used to when I used to get invited to, I mean, a lot of people used to watch this in this US universities. You had this custom of gathering in one room or in somebody's house and watching the games together. And I did that 1 or 2 times, but then I just couldn't watch the match with the same concentration and intention as I wanted to, because invariably you're like having a drink. There's a lot of noise. There's something or the other happening. You're talking to someone. And so you can't even watch what's happening in each ball. And so I stopped doing that after that. It's like, no, it's like cricket is my thing and it's my space. And I'll meet all you guys after the game, or, we'll find a way to, meet and talk about it. But I told them it's quite hard for me to watch it as a group. And obviously they understood. So it's totally fine. But I'm just saying, it's like the idea of that hardly, that is also fandom, and that space, you want to create that sacred space for yourself to watch and to focus and to have your own little routines that you have, or you don't want to get up when somebody's batting, you don't want to go to the restroom when something is happening in the game. All those are little things that you have for yourself, which you probably can't maintain in a community.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting point that you mentioned, right? Like there's this framework of breadth versus depth, and there's probably a category of people who are in it for the breadth, right? They're in it to get the bare minimum that they need to continue holding that water cooler conversation at the office or at school the next day. And then there are people who are in it because they're in it. Like it's like they have some type of deeper commitment to understanding whether the ball that was bowled was a dusra or not, right? Can they pick from the action of the bowler as they are striding up to the crease whether it is going to be a dusra or not, right? Who you want to feel, you're not trying to feel community with the rest of the people watching the game. You're trying to feel community with the people on the field, and that's very different. I think that there's two axes of fandom in some senses, where you're not looking to connect with other fans, but you're looking to connect with the people on the field, and you're very happy to find someone else like that, who's very different from the person who's just looking at it superficially to be able to talk about, oh, Harshdeep is a Khalistani because he dropped the ball. Like that is not the conversation at all you want to be having the next day.
Well, that is obviously extreme, but you'll also have these conversations that are like, you go and then you're like, you'll hear somebody say, who is this bowler? and looking at Arshdeep Singh, and you're like, okay, now obviously this is the first game that you're watching probably in like 5 years, right? And that irritates me in a sense. It's like not because I'm some elitism saying, oh, okay, I watch every single match, but just because I feel that we are not on the same frequency as cricket watchers, and I feel that while the other person may be a completely well-meaning individual, I just feel that it's not the right time to share that match with them when I probably have seen Arshdeep bowl in like the last 20 games, but they haven't even seen, don't even know who he is.
Yeah, that specific match I watched with people. India batted first, right? So I watched with people. People are asking, how much should India make? What are they? I'm like, they're batting first, dude. Oh, okay. So my point is like, yeah, I completely understand that, but fandom is all about change, right? Like you change as a person, and then your perspectives change over years and stuff like that. Yeah, I kind of become very, very tolerant to a lot of opinions, which I see because I have held them at some point, right? I have held some kind of misguided belief at some point, right? Friday you should not be playing Pakistan because they do the namaz and they get special powers, and then they come and beat India in Sharjah. Maybe at some point I would have believed that.
I think somebody actually looked at the stats of that, and it's not like many of those games weren't even on a Friday. So that Friday just took on that extra meaning because we probably had like some 3 of the most important games we remember that were on a
Yeah,
Friday.
exactly. So yeah, but that doesn't diminish the fervor in which you hold the views. I mean, when you hold that view, you're very convinced that that view is true. But as you grow, these all become very funny to me, and I live for that experience. I live for people who say such things. I find the humor in them.
Yeah, I know we talked a lot about technology and sort of access expanding. I wonder if for me personally, it has mattered immensely actually watching a sporting event live, right? I think like the sporting events that I've seen live most have been NBA games. And then I've seen cricket games, and then baseball games, and I've never seen any other sport live, more or less, I think. Oh, and I've seen tennis live because Chennai, thankfully, for a brief amount of time, had a tennis tournament, a ATP level tennis tournament. And so I think it makes a lot of difference. And I think in the 60s or the 70s, in the early times, I suspect there were probably fewer sporting events overall. But I also think proportionally the demand to see them was also lower. And so likely that a greater proportion of the population had seen something live, and likely that the higher degree was that they had seen a local team. And when I say local team, I don't just mean like, the Florida Panthers or the Green Bay Packers or the Warriors. I mean like the local high school team, the local college team. And I think the one thing that's very common in America is that like everyone has seen a sporting event live, right? Like starting at the high school level, it's almost part of it's not true anymore maybe now, but it's very much part of the ethos in America. It's less so, I think, in India where I grew up. Like if I so chose, I could have, and I think if it hadn't been for the tennis tournament like happening directly behind my school, I would have gone through my entire schooling never having seen a sporting event live. And I think that materially changes how you view and consume sport. I think the live experience really matters.
I agree, and I also think that within the live experience itself, there are multiple sort of ambiences where you can actually take in the game. Like you can go to a Ranji Trophy game where you're the only person there, or you're one of like 10 people there, and then the only other people there are the players and their maybe a couple of their friends and families. And then that is also an experience, right? Because it's quiet. all you're hearing is the sound of the bat and ball and the fielders and this and that. I mean, there's hardly anyone around. So that is one kind of thing. And then you have the packed stadium experience where you probably find yourself behind a pillar and can't even see a lot of the action, or you can't see much of the field, or you're in some, crazy height and altitude where the players are basically just ants moving around in the middle. But yet you feel something that's happening. You feel the crowd, you feel the size, you feel that great communal experience that you have. And then when you if your team wins, and then when you're walking out of the stadium, you actually feel the vibe there. When if they lose, you actually hear the silence as you go along. People, sometimes you may see someone crying or anything, right? So there are all those gradations of the physical experience. And it's interesting how it is so far removed from the TV experience, because TV is actively trying to give you something that's completely different from what you're experiencing there, because they're trying to get you as close as possible. They're trying to make the players as tight as possible in terms of their looks. They're not even giving any space between Virat Kohli's body and the rest of the field. It's like they're just focusing on Virat Kohli's body. Like the whole picture should just be Virat Kohli. That's it, and his face and his expressions, and that should become a meme. And that's what they are going for. So it's very interesting how you go, if you're somebody who's like regularly going to games, how your outlook of the team and the players and things can be quite different from someone who's just watching every game on TV.
It's worth thinking about, I guess, which of them lend themselves better to expanding a fan base versus which allow them to kind of allow you to dial in deep on your own fandom, right? So, I mean, I think one of the amazing things about watching any sport live is it just gives you a feel for the physicality and the athleticism of the event in a way watching on TV can't. Like, I mean, I don't. The first time I went and watched a match in Chinnaswamy, I think that's when I first had an appreciation for just how fast international bowlers bowl. I mean, I would always think, okay, you have the really fast bowlers, and then you have Glenn McGraw's a little slower, and then you have, Saurav Ganguly and stuff, and then you see Saurav Ganguly bowl, and you go, oh wow, that's faster than anybody I've ever seen bowl. And similarly, when you're in a stadium and you watch LeBron James coming, barreling down the lane, give the guy a medal for just stepping in front of him to take a charge, right? So that's the kind of thing I think you get in person that you don't get on TV. But on the flip side, so when I watch a basketball game, I typically like to watch on TV because I have like a couple of stats sites open and I'm checking what's happening. So I think it's much easier for me to gain an appreciation for some of the more analytical aspects when I'm watching on TV, which I really can't get in a stadium. Or watching cricket, for instance. I think, I don't think I could be in a stadium and get an appreciation for just how much Jadeja is able to pitch the ball in the exact same spot, ball after ball after ball, and hold the one end up. But watching it on TV, you can pretty easily do that.
And one thing that has always annoyed me about stadium experiences is that if you're distracted for a second and somebody makes a noise to your right, you turn and then a wicket falls, there is no replay. And you're pissed because there are only 10 wickets that fall, and then you're missed like 10% of your your action. So that has always worried me. I mean, I do agree that there is a value in watching matches in the stadium. It's a completely different experience. But for the reasons that I just said, I would rather prefer watching it on TV. I mean, I've been saying this for years now, and I've been pilloried in various circles because people are like, but you never get the feel. I'm like, I'm not about the feel. I want to watch the match. And now with Sony Live, you can go back to specific instances in the match where a wicket has fallen. So even if you are watching at home and you are away for a bit, you can come back and see that specific point where the wicket has fallen. So they do like live highlights. So those are things that technology can provide, and if you are into deeply observing the game, you can benefit from technology that you cannot in a stadium.
I also think there's a deeper point here about how you sort of view the game, and how you, the things that start mattering to you, the sort of things that start really affecting you. I think a lot of times when I go to the game, like if I used to go to a cricket game and there was like a bad umpiring decision, and you're like, okay, I mean, whatever. You sort of, and often, even in the press boxes, which are like right behind the bowler, you can get a sense, okay, that was probably a bad decision. That was probably going higher. But then the moment you start watching it on TV and the multiple replays and then the analysis of the commentators, plus then you go on social media and then you see the mass outrage that's happening there, I think then that particular dismissal starts mattering to you so much more than it would have when you are actually on the field. Because on the field, you see it, you're like, okay, and then you sort of move on to the next thing. But I feel like the whole my whole sort of priorities change when I'm in the field and when I'm in the ground and when I'm on watching on TV. And that impacts fandom too, right? Because eventually you're like, that's all the emotional churn that you're going through as a fan during the game, and somehow I felt like I'm far less angrier when I'm on the ground, which is also strange because on the ground is often when you have these crowd disturbances and people throwing bottles and all that has also happened. So obviously there is that charged value to it, but generally when I'm at the ground and when I come back, I'm far more relaxed irrespective of what has happened in the game than I'm on TV when sometimes I tend to get very worked up about things.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me is the fact that it's quite unlikely that that 100% of our game viewing experiences are either live or on TV. Right? What happens is that it tends to be a mix and match. And on a percentage basis, you're likely viewing 80% on TV and 20% on live. I mean, if you're lucky, you 20% of your sporting experience is live in your life. I think what happens is that they tend to reinforce each other in some ways. So, like for example, I think going to a basketball game live made me focus more on what's happening off the ball than I do when I was purely watching the game on TV, right? So
yeah, because you can't even see what's happening off the ball often on TV.
Exactly. Most of the time, you have that view that is like somewhere midway up half the court, right? And there are certain things happening that are just so surrounding the ball that you don't even watch. You don't watch the back screens. You don't see the player cutting until they actually receive the ball in their hands and they lay it up. And so, and you basically notice nothing on defense because you're just watching the offensive players. And so, it really, at least for basketball, it's really augmented the way that I watch the game. And I think it's combining the live experience with the TV watching experience has forced me to just be a better fan, actually.
Yeah, and it's absolutely. I mean, when I was used to go to games to cover, I used to really love trying to, first of all, I used to try and get there early. And thankfully, I had the access because I was part of the media thing. I had the access. I would actually try and go and speak to the groundsman or somebody related to the ground staff. Just shoot the breeze with them, and you never know. You might actually learn something about the pitch or about the ground, about their own life. And that was a huge part of my sort of early, going there 1 hour or 2 hours earlier before the match. Then even during the match, small things which you hardly see, which you never see on TV almost, like which way is the breeze blowing, especially when a spinner's bowling, you'd love to sort of gauge which way the breeze is blowing so that you can understand maybe what they're trying to do. Or small things like, there'll be some fielders, who have this tendency to walk in more than the others. Some of them like Ricky Ponting, I remember, used to almost have this brisk sort of movement towards the middle. While other fielders are a little more relaxed. So those small things give you some cues, I mean, when you see Ponting anticipate something as the bowler's running in, it's just wonderful to actually see the ball going there and him fielding it. I mean, that's something that you feel you would have never got on TV, and you're actually seeing it in live in person, and you feel so good about just the fact that you spotted it and you saw it. So those little things, I mean, that it adds so much to your appreciation. And sometimes when you're watching on TV, that's where you wish, you had these small cues them showing the field after every ball, or them mentioning some things about the wind. Some commentators do, and some TV production is really good to talk about these things. But yeah, you wish they could give you the feel of the ground. But I think TV largely is trying to create a kind of an alternate experience for you, which is different from what is in the ground. which is sort of shifting fandoms in several ways. So I actually want to get to the point about when the IPL started in 2008, one of the big questions that came up was that how are these franchises now going to get these fans, and how are they going to maintain the loyalty, which is of course a historical question for franchises all over the world, but the IPL sort of was going through that for the first time. So they made sure that they had all these icon players there, Sachin for Mumbai, Dravid for Bangalore. They all made sure that they are from their respective states. I think maybe there was Yuvraj in Punjab or something. Yeah. So they made sure it's that. So while they were going for the franchise team sort of supporting base, they also were very, very particular about individuals and star individuals being in this team, which is very interesting because traditionally people look down upon sort of supporting a team for the sake of an individual, right? I mean, if you say I support whatever RCB because I really love Virat Kohli, people will be like, there will be a sentiment of saying, but shouldn't you be supporting the team? Even though I see absolutely no problem in people who like Virat Kohli supporting RCB, I think it's great. I think you can support a team for whatever reason you want, and that's perfectly legitimate. But there seems to be a hierarchy of this support, right? It's like team, then maybe like some history or some story or some connection, maybe some family connection. Maybe your dad was a fan of Karnataka, and so you are also a fan of the Karnataka Ranji team. And then it's like finally the individual is like, okay, so you're like, okay, you're like a semi-fan kind of. That's the kind of impression it creates. So, but actually speaking, in the economic sense, Virat Kohli will probably be bringing more fans into RCB than any of these other reasons will be bringing fans. So economically, it's great to have Virat Kohli in RCB. So yeah, I mean, talk a bit about that, about this whole individual versus team dichotomy, which often it doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting, when the IPL first started up, and my parents have lived in Bangalore for a long time, and they continue to live there. And so I was kind of teasing them initially, like, oh, so you're going to be RCB fans. And I think my mom said something like, oh God, I'm not going to support Malya's team. And I thought that was pretty interesting, because it was like, it wasn't the Bangalore team, it was Malya's team, which I actually think really got at the heart of the difference between the way IPL franchises are versus the way, traditionally domestic cricket in India has been. Right now, of course, there are other ways in which private interests are more vested with some franchise versus other, but that's the way in which the IPL is pretty unique. And I think it's fascinating to consider in the context of places where franchise sports have existed for much longer, where you still have this idea that the team somehow merits your loyalty more than any player, right? And it's a little bizarre in some ways if you think about it. And I think, again, this is because we create these communities. And so there's this, it's just much easier to create this artificial construct of RCB fans versus it's just weird to think of, a community of Virat Kohli fans, because it's just stranger to think of that as a common bond. So I just think it's cool to see that actually happening. And I'm all for that personally, because, granted, it's pitching millionaires versus billionaires, but at the end of the day, I would still view the players as labor instead of the ownership. And I think where it's really interesting to think about is in the context of franchise football in Europe, where you do still have this private ownership in many places, but historically they've been tied to locations, and especially at lower divisions. And so, I'm not quite sure what to make of that kind of evolution in India and where that's coming from.
Yeah, as an example, I would watch Chris Gale, irrespective of where he plays, right? It doesn't matter to me what team he's playing, which team, which format, which this. If Chris Gale is batting and if I have access to it, if I can actually get that stream for it, I would watch. I've seen him play in a random, not random, they're all important leagues, but I've seen him play in leagues that I would never watch otherwise. I have a Bangladesh league, and I remember I watched him in, playing a Bangladesh league game. I happened to go to Canada to cover one global T20 tournament, which was one of those experimental leagues where he was playing, and I watched him this absolutely cream the bowling everywhere, hitting he lost some 5 balls and all. I watch Chris Gale anywhere. I cannot claim to be a fan of any of the teams that he's played for, but I'm a fan of Chris Gayle. So, and I think people should be happy with, organizers should be happy to have me because I'm going to tune in wherever Chris Gayle is playing, right? So why not?
I remember this idea of like supporting a team being better than supporting an individual seems very much like an artifact of the 90s to me. Like Bill Simmons very famously wrote a column in the page 2 of ESPN where he calls the laws of fandom, right? And it's just some very circuitous parochialism. Basically, this is what it comes down to. It's just really, really circuitous 10 rules of. It's like a BuzzFeed listicle of parochialism, right? Like that's.
And was one of the rules don't support a team for an individual? Was that a rule?
No, it wasn't a rule, but he has like very specific reasons why you can support a team that is not your home team. That are only like if you're born in a certain place, that's your team. Like just regardless of what happens. I don't think at that point the concept of supporting a team for an individual was not even on his radar. And I think I sent you guys this link as well. Like Seinfeld has this very famous joke where it actually occurs in the beginning of one of the Seinfeld episodes. He reduces all sports fandom to laundry fandom. He's like, oh, you're just supporting somebody's laundry. If that person goes to another team, you immediately, boo, you have to wail against this other person. So he specifically makes the point about that it's not about individuals. You're just supporting the laundry. And fast forward 10 years later, players are asking for trades on their social media accounts. That entire concept has been busted. Rohit's point about labor versus ownership, I think, is becoming more and more clear, where people are slowly, outside of the Green Bay Packers, who are the closest thing to a federated ownership that exists in the world, or there may be, I think there's a couple of clubs in England who might be the same way as well.
I think Barcelona is pretty similar. Yeah.
Sure. So, there's this very famous line that Chris Rock uses when he's talking about, where he's trying to make the differentiation between what it means to be wealthy and what it means to be rich. And the specific example he picks to make that case is he picks Shaq. He says, Shaq is rich. The white man who signs his check is wealthy. And he very clearly makes that distinction, right? And I think increasingly what people are starting to realize is that the players look more like them than the people who are signing the checks of the players. And then that sort of breeds the loyalty to the players much more than it does to the team. And it's manifested much more in sports like basketball, where they actually made the choice in the 90s to ride the fandom of a player. They made the explicit choice to ride Magic and Bird, and then ride Jordan. And then after Jordan, they were searching for so long, and then they found Shaq and Kobe, and then they made that specific choice. And then it's in some senses come back to bite the owners, right? And there's this constant debate of why that isn't the case for the NFL. And they think, is it because people wear helmets? And so you don't actually know, or the influence that any one player has on a team or on the outcome of a game is much lower in the NFL than, say, in baseball or in NFL or baseball. It's much lower than than, say, basketball, which is the other big league, or hockey. Hockey also is another place where they do wear helmets there too, but individual players do have a very strong brand image there. And so people are still trying to pass out why, but I think it's, to me, Rohit's point about labor versus ownership is the biggest one as to why I think people have decided to shift loyalties, if you will, from a team to a player.
Also, I think it's also a function of time and history, right? If I'm a fan of Virat Kohli versus, say, an RCB, people have seen Virat Kohli as an under-19 cricketer and then come into the Indian ranks and then, grow as a player. So they have a visual history of who he is as a player, and they've seen his growth. But let's say an IPL team like RCB, when it comes into being, then an RCB CSK match is marketed as a rivalry, but it is actually a borrowed rivalry of Tamil Nadu versus Karnataka. There is no actual history of a CSK versus RCB rivalry. For that rivalry to be established, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of close matches. It takes a lot of action to happen, and then you have an identity as a team. And once you have an identity as a team, you have an identity. I mean, fans can then have assume identities as followers of that team. Well, IPL is just 15 years old. I mean, 15, 16 years old. So it's not that long. It's not that long of a tournament for it to have historic rivalries. To even use the word historic, I am skeptical of using the words such as that. Maybe Chennai CSK versus MI, they have had a lot of close and very competitive matches. You can call that a rivalry. It has a shadowy outline of being a rivalry, but uh, teams have to go through years and years of them playing matches to build such a fan base. Whereas, Chris Gayle or a Virat Kohli or a Sachin Tendulkar, we have seen them for a very long time, and it's really natural to be fans of them. So RCB first becomes a team where Virat Kohli plays, and then it is, a team that represents Bangalore or whatnot. For it to go the other way around, let's say a Manchester United or whatnot. So those entities have existed for like decades, and therefore they have a history, and therefore they have justifiable fan base. So it's also a function of time. Maybe 25 years down the line, we can say CSK and MI have rivalries which have spanned across decades. But right now it's too young, and you have to remember that all this T20 thing started as a very frivolous, joyful exercise. It's just hit for fun thing. And for that mentality to slowly change into a serious form of cricket, which for the players is an employment opportunity, for the franchises, it's a business venture, and for the fans, it's like a serious mode of cricket to watch on, which has stakes. I think that takes time. 20 years is too short a time, in my opinion, for all such things to mature.
It is, but also one of the most interesting teams I find here is that not so much CSK or MI or KKR, who have also actually had some success, but an RCB who have not won a single tournament, but who, whose fans have, are probably like they are so loyal. They pack out the stadiums whenever they can. They are probably the most vocal on, extremely vocal on social media. They have this whole sort of they have a lot of connects right with RCB. They have a mascot. They have Mr. Nags. They have a lot of things going on, and then of course they've had great individual players like Gale, AB, and Kohli. But it's very interesting. I think in the long run, and I don't please don't troll me for this, but in the long run, I think the longer RCB doesn't win an IPL title, is actually like it's that anticipation itself is building up such a huge swell of fan base, and then finally, at some point they will win. I mean, it's not that they will never win. At least, I mean, I'm talking over the long run of 100 years, they will win something, and so that's only going to like usher in more and more, right? I mean, the classic example is Chicago Cubs or the Boston Red Sox that had this really long stretch of drought. They didn't win anything, but then they are still perhaps two of the biggest clubs in the baseball, even though they went 100 years, close to 100 years without winning. So it's almost like you have the bandwagoners coming in for the winning teams, and CSK probably has like thousands and thousands of fans who came in because of Dhoni or who came in because of all the titles that they've won. But on the other hand, you also have fans going into team like RCB that is not winning and anticipating that victory.
I mean, they're going into Ranji Trophy matches and screaming RCB.
And screaming RCB, right? I mean, that is taking things to a new level. So, yeah, I mean, so when talk a bit about this building like this fan base, like IPL teams did it in one way, but then there are all these other teams as well, which are, either mature teams in other sports or mature teams like even in leagues like the CPL and BBL. There are teams that are looking to figure out how to widen their fan base, and they're thinking of terms of loyalty. They're thinking of how to bring more people in. Of course, there's also the cliched, how to get more women to talk cricket, how to get that housewife who's going from the kitchen to the living room, to how to capture her attention. Very cliched and probably not apt. But yeah, these are the language that people often talk to get more women and families in. You have in England, you actually have the whole season that has been sort of pivoted around the 100 because they feel that at the peak of the summer holidays, they want more families to come in and watch the 100. Same thing in Australia. The BBL is held at the time when the children are off from school so that families can come. So, even apparently, the peak of the test season is now under consideration for rechange because of this. So you have all this going on, but you can't just have franchises and teams and expect people to come. You also have to actively find ways to market the product to them, right? I mean, to take it and talk on management terms. So what are your thoughts on that? How are teams doing it? And are some teams doing it better than others? Or are there some examples that come to mind?
So it's a couple of things on that. So one is, I think I would draw a distinction between teams that are trying to do that as new teams in established leagues versus just entire leagues trying to do that. So I think like a lot of the T20 leagues, basically every team is new, right? And so really they're not competing against each other. They're competing against something else entirely. And so I think that's one. So there, I think the word you use, product, is exactly right. Like what they're trying to sell is the overall product. And in some ways, like, if there are more Mumbai Indians fans, that's a win for RCB in some ways, right? Because that's more people watching the IPL period. I think it's different when you take say a team like the Brooklyn Nets, which is just they're trying to compete. I mean, they're trying to tell fans like, why should you care about us when you have legacy teams that have been around for 60 years, I think one
in a city like New York where you have
exactly.
10,000 other things to do other than watching the Brooklyn Nets.
Including a legacy team that continues to have one of the most supportive fan bases despite having stunk for 2 decades now. But I think one interesting case, and I don't know how generalizable this is, but I think it's really fascinating, is right here in our backyard where Deepak and I live. So in Oakland, there's a Division 2 soccer/football team called the Oakland Roots. And I think it's really interesting the approach they're taking, which is actually very locally bound. So the kind of backstory here is, I think Oakland folks feel betrayed by a series of franchises, right? So the Warriors left and moved to San Francisco. I mean, they were originally in San Francisco way back in the day, but functionally they were Oakland's team. They moved across the bay. That's one. The NFL team, the Raiders, decamped and moved to Vegas. And then the Oakland A's, the baseball team, are currently holding the city hostage. And I'm actually seeing regularly A's fans who are just disillusioned and leaving the team. Like that fan base, I think that team is bleeding fans at this point. So you have the Oakland Roots, and I think the ownership group were very sensitive to this, and they really felt, okay, what we really need to sell people on is this is Oakland's team. Like first and foremost, that's how we're going to establish a foothold. It's not about like, can we put the best soccer team out there? We care about that. Are we second division, not MLS, whatever? And so they've really invested in this kind of a couple of things. They support a lot of the community groups in Oakland. They've also tried to build this farm system in the way that, traditional, I think, European football teams have, like, Barcelona with La Masia or with the various youth academies. They're really trying to build a pipeline and support the local teams. And I mean, you go to the games and it's great. The tickets are cheap. The concessions are cheap, which is actually kind of a big deal at US sports because you can go to a stadium and spend a lot of money just on getting a drink and a small thing to eat. So those are cheap. They have a DJ who knows when to play local music, that kind of thing. But I think that's interesting because it's like an example of something that's clearly very attuned and trying to be responsible to local consideration and not abstract thoughts about like, okay, how can we sell a product? I'd be curious if there are other examples of that, but I think that's an interesting case study to follow.
Yeah, the typical things that I've seen are there's two of them that I've seen, right? One is consolidation. So you'll see, and this is historically, the ABA and the NBA merge, right? They make one. There were two football leagues. You just merge them and you make one, or two baseball leagues and you merge them and you make them like two separate divisions of one league. So there's a level of consolidation because divided fandoms is basically divided share of wallet from a business perspective. So that happens a lot, and I think like more or less you saw that in cricket as well. You had two competing leagues, and one was sort of like the
ICL.
That was not a
You're talking about the ICL and the
Yeah.
IPL.
Yeah.
One was basically blacklisted. That's it.
Yeah, one was
That it.
basically it was consolidated by force. So consolidation is the most common one, and you see that from like the most tenured franchise sports, even to something as new as cricket. The other one is like television rights, right? Like in scale, and if you think about a league like the NBA that seems so good at marketing itself today, if you go all the way back to 1979, the finals, the NBA like championship finals was shown on ABC on tape delay. So basically, you wouldn't even get to see the finals of the NBA championships live. It would be recorded, and then it would show up later when it was not on prime time. So that it doesn't disturb what traditionally goes on prime time on TV. And so what they first needed like really strong franchises to show up. Second thing that they did is like local owners started buying like these local cable networks. And this is something that we saw happen a lot in India as well. Like you'd have a local cable provider who would play like the most recent TV, a bootleg version of the most recent movie that released in the theater. Your local cable provider would play it. In the same way, like Jerry Buss was an example who owned the Los Angeles Lakers. What he did is he created a cable channel called Prime Ticket that exclusively allowed people to see away games as well as home games live. And the explicit reason he did that is because the Great Western Forum, which is where the Los Angeles Lakers played, would only house 18,000, 20,000 people, like even fewer probably. And he said, I cannot have that be my only revenue source. Ticketing at that event cannot be my only revenue source. I need people to watch some way. And so he created essentially the first subscription streaming sports service, which is like a cable channel that allowed you to watch the Lakers wherever you were in the broader Los Angeles geographical area. And then that eventually merged with ESPN and so on and so forth, right? So like that, what people try to do is then expand coverage and then get better TV rights and sales and like viewership. And so eyeballs is the other thing. And then the third thing that happened as a result of this expansion is that he found that demand shot up for the live events. Because when you expand your base, you now have more people wanting to see stuff live, and he's able to raise prices. And so you had this sort of like flywheel of, more people wanting to see, more demand for live, and then that goes up. And so like I think in some senses, we are now at a stage where that second lever of like expansion through television is completely off the table, right? Like now, like that's like the starting point. You have to have TV rights. You don't even like you can't expand that in any way. And so the challenge is primarily doing what one of two things happen, like building that local the avenues available to teams are basically building that local connection, like Rohit said, bring in a star player and sort of like capitalize on their brand equity to increase or just perform. Right, you have to win, and you allow the bandwagoners to join and build out the fan base. Like those tend to be like the big ways that sports teams then build out their fandom.
I think the challenges to cricket is kind of unique because at least in all the professional league games in the US, each league plays out like hundreds of games, right? In a given season. So it is actually not viable for one person to watch all the games of even one specific franchise.
Except NFL is much lesser, of course, because it's probably like 15, 16 games in a team. But yeah, MLB, NBA, and all are like hundreds.
Yeah, hundreds. So at least the problem then for cricket is that it supports various formats in that, but its resources are centralized and the administration is also centralized. So you are in fact then having a limited number of resources, whether in terms of players or facilities, but you want to stretch them across various formats, and you have only 12 months a year, and then you try to schedule it. You try to cram everything so that you get the maximum value out of your limited resources. So cricket in itself has to decide. I mean, it's specifically an ICC problem that how it wants to, demarcate its resources and treat each format as its own separate thing with its own hierarchies and stuff. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that if your resources are minimal, which is the star players, let's say a Kohli or a Ben Stokes is expected to play a test match, and then a one dayer and then a T20, it's not going to be a viable long-term solution for the game itself. And therefore that has, a maximal impact on the fandom as well. So it has to start, trying to demarcate each format as its own and try to build facilities and resources as its own so that it can build a fan base of its own. A T20 fan doesn't necessarily have to follow, a national game between India or Pakistan. Today, there is no differentiation between the two people. They are the same person, right? And so that has to come out. That diversity has to come out, or else what's going to happen is that you're going to exhaust all your resources, and then it will become an exercise of tedium and repetition, and you might lose to other sports because, as we said in the beginning, the technology that is available today is not what it was 30 years ago. So people have options of changing the channel and watching, an English Premier League or a basketball game or whatnot. And people have done so. I mean, a lot of young people that I meet are people who are, invested a lot more into football and basketball or baseball because primarily it's a matter of cool for them, quote unquote cool for them. Like, I am not the pleb that follows cricket in India. I am like a higher order of being that follows football or, basketball or whatnot. So I am cool that way because that is also a valid way of fandom. I mean, I don't look down upon it because that's how probably all of us started also. But that differentiation is, to prevent that differentiation, cricket has to evolve a little bit more, and it has to give some kind of, diverse paths for fans to follow rather than a single timetable that everybody follows. Then you start to lose out on young people. People start making tinkering rules of the game. I think you have to look at the game in itself as now a three streamed entity and treat each stream differently. So that is something that nobody is thinking about. Probably that will have, the maximum impact of fandom, let's say 10-15 years down the line, if they continue doing this.
I think it's going to be interesting with the IPL, and please tell me if you feel like this is already happening, but I think it's going to be interesting when you start having, what are things that, RCB fans can identify as being like in some ways unique to RCB versus say CSK, and not like, if you ask RCB fans, why do you watch the IPL? And the reasons they're giving are not IPL reasons, but like RCB reasons specifically, right? I think I haven't encountered those so far, which is why I thought, like, for instance, CSK, when they started the Whistle Porter campaign, I thought that was cool because like there was something like uniquely Chennai about that in a way that like, I don't think any of the other franchise cities could claim. But I think that's when it'll start to get interesting. And maybe to Ashoka's point, this is all calculated, and the IPL first wants to establish itself as a league, make sure there are IPL fans before getting to like those differentiations. But I think that's when you start seeing that evolution of a sport in the league.
I think the CSK evolution happened in that season where they were in Pune, right? Where they were based in Pune. And then you had all this like hundreds and thousands of people from Chennai going to Pune. There were trains running from Chennai to Pune with fans going and supporting. I mean, that was like mind blowing to see and to have that sort of connect to a team so entwined that you're willing to do that, right? I mean, there were like all that organization of that happening, and the very fact of. And I think, in a way, you can argue that the 2-year ban actually helped them more than in terms of the fans, because the absence makes your heart grow fonder at the end, and they were missing them so much, and they came back, and not only did they come back, they won that season.
It is more an exception than a rule. Because Rajasthan Royals, Delhi Capitals, they have been franchises for 15 years as well, but you don't hear the stories. So there is an inequality about fandom in cricket, and also there is a lot of being a cricket fan these days is like being a very schizophrenic entity, right? You are the fan for CSK for 2 months, and then you turn around and you become an India fan when India is playing Australia, right? And then you turn around being, a fan of a player when that player is playing against South Africa. So it is a very schizophrenic deal, and I don't think that is part and parcel of being a fan. I mean, that is not a long-term deal. You have to split, or you have to have some sort of diversity option where a T20 fan can, continue being a T20 fan. If he or she wants to expand his or her identity beyond T20, that should be fine. But you have to give a strong base for them. Today, you are forced to be five different things as a fan if you're just following cricket, and that is not a good foundation for fandom, at least in my experience. I mean, there is no history building. There is no, something that you can call traditions. These are things that are very important for fandom, and that is something that I think cricket as a community itself should start thinking about.
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing in any kind of sort of relationship you have with the team is that the team and the life that you have is sort of gets entwined, right? Like NFL is a classic example here. Like NFL games happen almost always on Sunday. If not, they happen on Monday nights, which is marketed as its own Monday Night Football, or they happen on Thursday night, which has its own thing. But Sundays is NFL Day, and as it was famously said, I think Deepak pointed it out that the NFL took people away from the church and brought them to the to the stadiums, or brought them to the TV, and that is what bigger achievement can you have for a sport where you are actually diverting people from church on Sunday morning and getting them to watch a sport, right? And Sunday mornings, like anyone who's lived in America would know that a large part of people devote to NFL. I mean, whether the stuff they're cooking, the people they're meeting, the places they're going, life is organized around those games on Sundays. And the sort of cricket needs to start finding ways to do that. 2 points quickly. One is still, you brought up the ICL. Still astonishes me that for 2 seasons there was a team from Lahore, the Lahore Badshahs, completely drawn from Lahore, like the Pakistanis playing in India in grounds that were packed. Like there were grounds in Hyderabad that were just packed to watch the Lahore Badshahs play. And the Lahore Badshahs actually won one season of the ICL. I mean, imagine the sort of the world it was back then, right? Can you even imagine like anything remotely? Even if it comes up for discussion, you're an anti-national today, right? I mean, that's it. You just mentioned a Pakistan team should play in India. That's it. Okay, bye. Get out. Leave. That is one. And number two is that we spoke about television and live experiences, right? I feel that a large proportion of cricket leagues are looking to are trying to find ways in which they can get TV fans, right? Like, how can we get more people to watch our team on TV or watch our league on TV? That's the way in which they're structured. But the one league that stands out for me in that sense is the CPL, the Caribbean Premier League, which basically for them, it was very hard to get a lot of people outside the Caribbean to watch them on TV because of the time zone, right? It's very hard to expect Indians to stay up late or wake up early just to watch like a Caribbean Premier League team. So they went totally the reverse route. They said, at least in the early days, they said, let's focus on the people who live in the specific islands and focus on getting them into these games and making getting all the stadiums packed out, so that then we start developing like a connection with the local community, and let's build it that way. So that was a very interesting format. And I think the CPL, I mean, they've gone through a lot of ups and downs, but I still think that as a league, they still are quite original in the way that the cricket is maintained. They have managed to get that whole Caribbean party atmosphere in there. People love going to CPL games because for them, it's also like to have some fun. It's not just to watch cricket. It's also to have a drink, have fun, support your local team. And they've created that carnival-like branding very well. And, West Indies domestic cricket doesn't get anywhere as close to that kind of response. But the CPL has become that place where the locals go and support their team. And thankfully, also they've had the West Indies has been a T20 dynasty for a while. I mean, they've had some of the greatest T20 players come out of there, and so that's also helped them build more fans. So yeah, I thought I should bring up those points.
Yeah, Sibi, before we move off this, I think like we missed a couple of things that actually cricket has done a good job of like transporting from elsewhere, and that give fans skin in the game, right? One is betting. And let's leave the adverse effects of betting aside, but betting definitely helps with fans getting skin in the game. The other is fantasy sports, and like that's a huge part of the subculture. Since you mentioned the NFL, like the NFL subculture is almost driven by fantasy sports at this point, to the point where like you have TV shows about people who are in a fantasy sports league together. I think
and
cricket's doing
YouTube videos of millions of views and all, just one guy giving tips for this week's fantasy picks. That'll have some 3 million views.
It's the US equivalent of the horoscope, right? Like every day morning on a TV channel, and on Asta TV, someone comes up and says your weekly horoscope. It's like the equivalent.
Bejan Daruwala. Yeah, that India have to play like two left-handers at number 6 and 7 if they have to have a chance of winning. And all.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. Fantasy sports, and we did an episode actually with Ashoka and Gaurav Sundaraman on fantasy sports and cricket, and how that is playing a huge role in the IPL itself, and that is also creating its own schizophrenic fandoms, because you don't know whether to support your team or whether to support that guy because he is actually in your fantasy team and all that. So we brought up those aspects of fandom as well. Yeah.
Personally, I'm extremely proud that I brought this point up and not Ashoka. So I must just say that.
I thought I did a podcast on this, so let me not, blow my own trumpet.
Okay. Yeah.
One issue that I wanted to bring up is the conflict that you have as a fan, right? And now this is becoming quite even more sort of vocal in the Indian cricket context and in the IPL context too. We did a podcast about CSK and fandom with a couple of CSK fans, Arvind Desai and Tejas Jayaraman. And they spoke about how, during the time when the whole spot fixing allegations were going on, and how they felt quite alienated from the team. And Ashoka was also there at that point. They felt quite alienated from the team because nothing was really being clear to them, like what was happening, why it was happening. There's not that much transparency, right? So they were feeling alienated. Now, of course, in Indian cricket, with the sort of the nexus between the Indian, the party in power and the BCCI, with Jay Shah being a big part of the BCCI, there's also this whole conflict of, people being unsure who is really controlling things, what is happening, is how much is the politics and the cricket being really entwined. And so you have this whole set of fans who are like quite not sure, right? Like okay, we're supporting the team, but there's also this whole sense of the party trying to use cricket as a political tool to, either in terms of the triumphalism or in terms of trying to find soft targets of the minorities in India, supporting Pakistan, etc., whatever. So there are a lot of questions about the loyalty to the team. NFL, as a classic example, was during the whole Kaepernick saga, right? Like Colin Kaepernick decided to take a knee because he felt that he had to speak up about injustices to the community, the African American community. But that was such a big sort of a cry about him being not being patriotic. And then, of course, he hasn't been signed. He lost his contract. He hasn't been signed after that. And irrespective of what you think of him, the fact is that a player like him not being in the league has its own ramifications in terms of your own fandom and what you think of the NFL. And there are also these other militaristic aspects of the NFL where, you have people in army fatigues coming and doing their own thing. You have US Air Force flights flying over the thing before the Super Bowl or before some important games. And that can lead to its own conflict. So we need to touch upon that a bit, especially in this day and age where, there's so much information. And it's not like before, like when you were probably, Mike Marquisee talks about it very sort of evocatively in War Minus the Shooting about the whole India-Pakistan game in 96. And I was actually at the game and I felt a degree of discomfort and I sort of vaguely felt what he was saying, but I couldn't articulate it then because I was too young. But the fact is that as a fan, you also are like, sometimes you feel, is this so serious? Like, do we have to take these things so seriously to connect it to all these, nation and army and war and fighting? And can't we just treat it like a sport? And so, yeah, you do tend to get a bit disillusioned with that whole thing. What are your experiences about that? And where do you think one draws the line? I mean, it's, for me at least, being a cricket fan or a sports fan is constantly living in this state of conflict, right? It's like, what am I actually watching? I mean, is this even worth it? Why should I be watching the NFL and supporting these guys who are like, trying to bring in all these militaristic overtones into it? But at the same time, I'm drawn to the sport. I want to watch it.
I don't think this is an especially original point, but everything is political. Like even when people say sports and politics should mix, like that is a political stance. That's a political statement, right? And so, like, you're always choosing to draw a line. You are always choosing to play this game in terms of whether something is a political statement or not. So when you say like I don't want to consider it, and I'm using the editorial you here, not you said. If somebody doesn't want to consider it, they're still doing it. They just are drawing it differently. So, I mean, that's one thought on that. I think you could say one of two things, like either, this bothers me, or it doesn't bother me because, I think it's just I'm able to have that separation. But I don't think that latter statement is that different from saying it doesn't bother me because it doesn't bother me. And so, I mean, in the context of sports here, I think famously in the lead up to the 2016 election, Bill Belichick, wrote a letter to Donald Trump and which he tom-tommed, and Tom Brady had like one of those MAGA hats in his locker. And I lived in Boston at the time and I had so many Patriots fans who were like, oh, whatever, we separate them, sports and politics shouldn't mix. They always mix. And so I think I don't know if there's a comfortable resolution. It's just a discomfort we have to sit with. I know that, for instance, not in the political realm, but you mentioned spot fixing, right? When the match fixing saga happened in the early 2000s, for a while, my grandma, who was one of the most rabid cricket fans I knew, just stopped watching cricket because she was like, I just don't get the same thrill out of watching it. And this wasn't like her choosing to make a political statement. She just didn't feel that visceral thrill anymore. And I think sometimes I feel the same way. Like, I don't watch football anyway. And I think everything around Colin Kaepernick and concussions and the way the league conducts itself makes it very hard for me to get that kind of thrill. But that's not really a considered statement, me choosing not to care about how the Brooklyn Nets do when Kyrie decided that vaccine mandates are the biggest human rights violation somehow. That was a more considered stance because all of the things being equal, I would still like that team to do well. So.
Yeah, I think like I agree with Rohit when he says everything is political. And I think I'm going to say something controversial, which is sports is more important than politics. I think I'm very much in the camp of, the Shehan Karnatilaka's line, like, unlike life and death, sports matter. So that's very much my camp. And so what I've actually found when I've been most disappointed with sports people or sports teams is when the integrity in some senses of the sport itself comes into question. So I was a huge Hansi Cronje fan until it was impossible to remain a huge Hansi Cronje fan anymore. In much the same way that I was a huge Azhar fan until it was impossible to remain Azhar fan anymore. And when things like that happen, or for example, when you found out that Tim Donaghy refereed one of the Western Conference finals in 2002 when the Lakers won, you find out that all of the gains that the NFL has made in terms of franchise equity over years has been through hiding the fact that they are basically rendering their players unable to have a reasonable quality of life post 40, right? Like those kinds of things actually matter to me a lot more than, say, Kaepernick's issue in the NFL. Like, if you ask me, like, the concussion issue is a much larger issue because you're building you're building wealth off of destroying people's lives much more than the fact that a single player like Kaepernick can't play. In fact, like, if you think about the two extremes, like if you think about the NFL as one extreme of like just completely shutting Kaepernick out and not dealing with his protest in any way at all, versus the NBA's sort of cringy response of having everybody kneel for games for a certain playoff run. I'm like, dude, like it makes no sense. Everybody kneeling is useless. Like it doesn't tell me anything. Like he's what Kaepernick's stance mattered because he went against the grain. You know, like when the league sanctions something and they print a bunch of T-shirts against it, and like immediately to me it dilutes the value of what Kaepernick did and not emboldened.
Then that becomes an ad, right?
Exactly.
What the league is doing is an ad. Yeah.
It's an ad for the league, right? Like it's like, oh, we are the most progressive league. Like, okay, fine, whatever. Like, and it basically all it does is it allows Ted Cruz to go after them, which means more people will watch what Ted Cruz says and watch what the games do. Like it's just like a symbiotic relationship, which I kind of like. I think like once all that happened, I was like, okay, this is a sideshow. Let's put the sideshow aside. And like sports is more important than that. Because I think like it's one of the, like, let's just, you can probably count off on one hand the things that truly unify, right? Like you have either two individuals or two teams or two groups of people that are going head to head in the most physical manner possible. And at the end, have to still shake hands and say, good job, guys. Right? To me, like that's way more important than politics. So like ultimately, like I think I think anything to do with politics and sports is a bit of a sideshow. And things that question the fundamental integrity of the sport itself are far more critical and like cause me to sort of ramp my fandom up and down than say the political implications of something.
But even that, right? Like, see, it also depends on what stage of life and fandom you're in. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, I stopped watching cricket for like nearly 1 year in that 2001 phase, right? Like, basically when that match fixing happened, because Azhar was like a huge part of my growing up, and I had such fond memories of Azhar. And then the moment that happened, I was like, oh, okay, just what's the point, right? And it's only like, and for a person like me who was basically just totally into cricket, to do that was a big deal. But recently, it's very interesting that I was having a discussion with a friend of mine here who has no idea of cricket, a friend of mine in America. Absolutely no idea of cricket, but a huge baseball fan. And we were talking about wristiness, right? In baseball and wristiness. And I was trying to tell him how, I'm used to a level of wristiness that you will never see in a baseball game. I mean, you find wristy baseball hitters, but so I showed him a few videos of Azhar. I just sent him a few videos of Azhar. And then he got so fascinated by Azhar that he went and basically just ransacked YouTube for Azhar videos, and he started watching, and he started like telling me about some random games that I had even forgotten about, because he found it on YouTube, and he's like, how the hell did this guy, how is he doing this and all that? Now, this guy has no idea of Azhar, what happened to Azhar in 2000, why about this thing. So my question is, like, I'm feeling a bit bad that eventually he'll find out, and then eventually, like, he may or may not care, because for him, he's watching Azhar for his wristiness. He's not watching him for anything else. He's watching him for the way he's batting, right? So it's interesting how, I mean, eventually, I guess we'll have a conversation. I'll have a chat with him and tell him that how it impacted me. But I'd like to think that he probably won't care as much as I did, because for me, it was like shaking up my whole foundation. But for him, it's not. So, and should I judge him for it? No, I'm like, okay, he likes watching him, right? So it also depends on the phase in which you're in, when you discover these players, what you see in them and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the severity of the offense itself, right? Like an individual, like one ref, like Tim Donaghy being off, doesn't make me call into question everything that ever happens on the field in baseball, or Hansi and Azhar doesn't. It may have at one point caused me to question everything that ever happens on a cricket field, but it doesn't anymore with distance. But the NFL, like every time I hear a crunch, I'm like, okay, I can't watch this sport anymore in good conscience, right? And so I'm like, I'm done. I am completely out. I canceled my Prime ticket subscription. I don't watch NFL, and I don't watch college football anymore either. So any football I do not watch, primarily because everything that happens on the field reminds me of this this subterfuge that completely alters my perception of the sport. And so like I am unable to watch the NFL anymore, primarily for that reason. Sorry, Ashok. I know
and this is after the movie, is it? This is after that Will Smith.
No.
Movie,
after
or before itself?
Before the movie. So once I found out that the league had been for ages, like not acknowledging these asks for help, and they had tried to discredit the doctor who was trying to bring it to the fore, actively discredit him. Like until once all that came out, I pretty much said, okay, I can't watch the NFL anymore. Like this is like in good conscience, I cannot support a sport where all equity and value that's being built for the franchises and the owners is not off of like just underpaying their labor, but like actively destroying their labor, And so that is like a really, really tough like bridge to cross for me.
Yeah, but then which brings me to the point about the game itself and the players themselves and the sort of the other aspects, right? Like the ownership and the league and the country or whatever that you have. I mean, I think Rohit, you had brought up the example of the Manchester United fans, right? Like if they've had so much of saga going on in the ownership front, they've had American owners, they've had all sorts of owners, but the fans itself it's not like it doesn't seem to be as if their fandom for Manchester United has majorly changed. I mean, you'll find Manchester United fans come and throw a lot of mud on the owners themselves, but it's not like they are going to abandon their team because of that. But I think that is very different from, say, an Indian setup of an IPL or maybe even an American setup. If for instance, Donald Trump owned an NFL team, for instance, I can imagine, and
he did.
I'm talking.
He was called Donald Sterling.
Oh yeah, Donald Sterling. Yeah. If I can imagine the sort of a lot of fans abandoning that team, or for instance in India, if there is a notorious character who, like you mentioned Malia, right? Like people did think of Vijay Malia when RCB started. People I'm sure thought of all the other owners who had shady reputations when that came in as well. I don't want to name anyone here, but I'm sure there were many thoughts there. So yeah, let's talk a bit about that as well, because for some it's just the players, it's just the team. And their relationship with the team is more sacrosanct than whoever may come and own that team.
I mean, right, this is where I get back to like the imagined communities idea, right? Like that's this idea that like the team just exists separate from ownership. And I mean, I don't think this is entirely an unwarranted idea. I mean, I think there is something to the idea that ownership owes a responsibility to fans of the place they're in, and which is why it feels especially grotesque when they try to strong arm cities into putting money into stadiums or something like that. I think it's interesting to think at what point that kicks in. I mean, you have a team like Manchester United that has existed for a long time, and so it's much easier to think of it as an entity that exists separate from the Glazers. I wonder if people would feel the same way with RCB and Malia, say. I mean, I would argue that maybe people do, but maybe there's some circuitous logic I'm having here, because like part of what that's relying on is the fact that like maybe RCB wouldn't have the fans that it does if people didn't think of it as a separate entity. So I'm not sure where it starts.
I think there's a cultural issue here as well. I think it's different in different parts of the world, and it's also got to do with, I mean, I think in America, partly it's also because sport is so intertwined in culture and life, and also is seen as this, when teams leave, I mean, like, there are documentaries on this, and I think the Baltimore Colts were a classic example of basically decided to pack up and move, and they moved to Indianapolis. And there's a whole documentary on this in ESPN, 30 for 30. Check it out. And the sort of betrayal that the fans felt on that day for when the team left. I mean, even today, it's like, they 60, 70-year-old fans talk so deeply and passionately about it. Same thing in Seattle, where I live, when the Seattle Supersonics moved. I mean, there's a lot of people I know don't even watch basketball anymore after that day when the team left, because they felt a sense of deep betrayal. I don't know how that will work out in the IPL. I mean, there have been teams that have been that have gone away. They don't exist anymore. But I don't think like a team in Kochi, for instance, has abandoned the IPL because the Kochi Tuskers don't exist anymore. And I think also IPL is probably too young in it's not it's way too raw in its fandom and evolution. Maybe, 10 years down the line, if CSK says, we're moving ship, the IPL basically says, this franchise has to move somewhere else and change their name. Maybe fans like Ashoka will feel that deep sense of betrayal, but I think as of now, they're not there yet. So it's hard to say how that will be. It'll be interesting to see that, though.
Yeah, I think the IPL is kind of unique in the sense that most of the owners had their own giant public persona independent of the sport itself, right? Like Shah Rukh and Preeti Zinta and Ambani's and Shilpa Shetty. In fact, if you think about it, like N. Srinivasan is probably the least well-known of the rest, or out of the owners.
When he's in fact been more involved in cricket than anyone else. Yeah,
exactly.
But he made it up in like 5-6 years. He became well-known later.
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing for me, is that N. Srinivasan's legend has grown with the legend of CSK. It's the one of the few cases, like in much the sense that like here, right? Like nobody even knew that Jerry Buss was a PhD and not a real doctor for many years when he was owning the Lakers. They just know him as Dr. Buss, and like the Dr. Buss's legend grew with the legend of the Lakers. In much the same way that happened, like there are, like I think N. Srinivasan's legend pretty much grew with the legend of CSK. Like I think if you were originally from Chennai, you knew who he was and you knew what India Cements was and stuff. But most people didn't know, and I think like he's actually the prime example of how ownership can actually leverage the team to build their own sort of brand equity if they wanted one.
But also it's the reverse, right? N. Srinivasan was had his own issues in the BCCI, and during that whole spot fixing scandal, there was a lot of stuff come out about him. But it's not like the CSK fans necessarily. It's not that their relationship with the team changed because of that. It changed. I think it probably grew a bit stronger.
Yeah, no. So the primary relationship was with the team and not with N. Srinivasan. That's the point I was trying to make. I still remember the advent of the IPL. Like there are Shah Rukh Khan fans who decided to follow KKR, right? Like that was a thing. Like that. In fact, like I would say that was the design almost, is that you would have these people's fans sort of flowing into the game. CSK is one of those few teams where the fandom started with the team, and so like those are the cases where it didn't matter. And oftentimes there are, like in franchise sports, teams can stay with cities and owners can change. Like that's happened. The Dallas Mavs, for example, right? Cuban bought it, and in fact, it became more of the team of the city because Cuban is from Dallas, and he made changes that sort of like reflected the character of the city in some senses. So I think ownership is also fungible in when it's a true marketplace. I don't think that is the case though with the IPL. I don't think ownership is going. Like, it's not like the Ambanis are not selling the Mumbai Indians anytime soon. Like, that's not going to happen.
But the interesting bit that is happening is that, IPL teams are now spreading their wings, right? Like the South African League, for instance, has IPL sort of connections. There's teams in the West, in the Caribbean Premier League, that has IPL connections, like the Trinbago Knight Riders, and there are all these teams there. So eventually, if we do reach a stage where there's IPL ownership in various countries, it'll be interesting to see how those fan bases then react to the change of ownership or the news that comes in, some scandal that happens or something related to the ownership. So that will be interesting. Like South Africa, for instance, will the fans of that Johannesburg team be extremely sort of feel betrayed if something happens from the ownership front? So that'll be an interesting trend to watch out for in, say, the next 10 years.
And secondly, I mean, at least with the IPL teams, the way they were designed, and I hate to use this term, top of the funnel, they were the top of the funnel for their owners, right? Like they bring in a lot of fans from which they can then sell all their other goods. And so that is like a marketing property, which is now assuming its own identity, as you can say. Like once they realized, oh, this is a profitable venture in and of its own. I think the other day I was telling you guys that CSK has its own set of unlisted shares, which are very valuable. So in and of itself,
how many do you own? How many shares do you own?
I am not that rich. I am only rich enough to watch it. I am not rich enough to buy stakes. So anyway, I mean, now they are realizing that this is and I think CSK is one of those few franchises which is valued at $1 billion. So it has a unicorn valuation, is what I heard. So therefore, now they are realizing that this is in fact an entity in of its own that can be governed with its own organization. So now that dynamic is changing, and ownership is now not just ownership; it's also membership, right? Like CSK, I don't think can give up Dhoni the same way RCB can give up Kohli. If they stop playing, they still have to be associated in one way or the other, because now they are like the entry point for clubs to bring their members in, or the patrons or the fans or whoever, to bring them in, and they have become like part of the property.
So they'll be like mentors and all, you're saying?
Yeah. So they will be part of the ecosystem for a long time to come, because that is like the name association with the brand. Like you can't talk about CSK without mentioning Dhoni, RCB without mentioning Kohli, Mumbai Indians without mentioning Sachin or Rohit Sharma. So now they are realizing that these are things that need to be handled. This is not how it started, but now it is evolving into a venture of its own. I mean, franchises are now becoming organizations that I don't even think IPL itself imagined them to be. Now I think this will be interesting, because I think now they'll have far more greater clout, or financial clout, or in terms of mobility of players and whatnot, to influence decisions of the league itself. And that is something that will be interesting. But from a fandom point of view, I think consolidation of power is always a bad thing for a fan, because you are going to get what they are going to show you, not what you want. So I don't think that's a good idea. But I mean, good news for fans, but great news for all those 8 or 9 guys who own IPL teams.
So so thanks so much for joining, Rohit, Deepak, and Ashoka. A lot of things to think about, interesting conversations. Maybe next time when you watch a game, you might think of fandom in your own, you might have your own thoughts about fandom. So write to us, tweet us, leave a comment on the website. 81allout.com is the website, at 81allout on Twitter. And, as I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, please pick up the books we have republished. I'll give the link to Cricket Beyond the Bazaar and War Minus the Shooting. Both fantastic books. The first by Mike Coward and the second by Mike Marquesi. So pick it up, read it, and let us know what you think of it. Otherwise, yeah, thanks for joining, and we'll see you soon.
India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.